Thanks, Jamie. Good morning, everybody. We are the Social Justice Assessment Subcommittee of the Innovations in Assessment Fact 2 Task Group. My name is Judy Littlejohn. I'm the instructional designer at Genesee Community College in Batavia, and I co-chair this group with Megan Freewald of Alfred. She's here with us. And other group members include Chris Price of SUNY, Shanna Driscoll-Silvato of Cortland, and Caitlin Burton-Prager of FIT. And Caitlin contributed a lot to this presentation, but she's unable to be with us today. And we're going to start off with Shanna, who has a question for all of you.
Good morning, everyone. So first, we'd just like to ask you to contribute to the chat and share with us what brought you here today. So either looking at the title of our presentation or the description of it, please just share what inspired you to join us. And you can think about this question as you are considering that. So what does inclusive and equitable assessment mean to you? So this is an area that we have found in our discussions and research that a lot of folks have a high interest in, but perhaps hadn't really thought a lot about or really don't know where to go for information. So, oh, I'm sorry, I said add it to the chat. Please add it to the Jamboard. So we will have the Jamboard link in the chat. And so go ahead and just click that Jamboard link. And on the Jamboard, please go ahead and add your own thoughts. What brought you here today? And also, what does inclusive and equitable assessment mean to you? Feel free to either put those on separate posts or in the same post, whatever works best. So we'll give everyone a few minutes to do that. And if you're having any technical issues with the Jamboard, please just post in the chat for us. And we will be using this Jamboard for a few other questions and opportunities to collaborate throughout the presentation today. So go ahead and leave that tab open as you're finishing.
It's so fun to watch the board being populated.
All right, great. So please feel free, if you are still working on that, please go ahead and continue. But we will continue on with our next slide here. And just to tell you a little bit about our subgroup. So again, as Judy had introduced us all, we are from all over the state at different institutions and in very different fields, but we have come together in this common interest that we have in this topic. And so our subgroup, in the meetings that we have and the activities that we've been planning, the goals that we have are to explore the research on social justice assessment. And so what we found in developing the title for this presentation was that oftentimes when people think about social justice assessment, the focus tends to be on assessing social justice, and that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at assessment being socially just and also being inclusive and being equitable. So if you hear us using these two terms of social justice assessment and also inclusive and equitable assessment, know that we are focusing on the same thing. The other thing that we've been focusing on in terms of our goals are identifying strategies that faculty members can use to assess their students equitably and justly, and really across disciplines, across fields, looking at students who are perhaps taking a course as a requirement or as an elective, but they're perhaps not going to go on and study in that field. So looking at strategies that we can apply to a lot of different scenarios. And then lastly, what we've been doing throughout the year too is curating resources, examples, and best practices for equitable, diverse, and socially just assessment. And what we'll be doing in our presentation today is showing you some of the results of those resources that we've been curating. So we'll show you and take you on a tour of a couple of websites and then provide you links for you to explore later on your own. And next we'll go on to Chris talking about a definition.
Yeah, thanks, Shenna. So as Shenna mentioned, social justice assessment is a approach to assessment that takes social justice as a lens. When we titled this presentation, we titled it Equitable and Inclusive Assessment because that is what the heart of social justice assessment is all about. It really tries to, it's innovative in that, most assessment is is the total opposite of that, right? And we'll talk a lot about that as we go through our presentation. And most people who think about assessment don't consider, and we're not really ever socialized as instructors to consider equity and inclusion when it comes to assessment. Assessment typically, traditionally, has been about sorting, has been about trying to sort of not necessarily include all students and really kind of impose uniformity on students. And so social justice assessment kind of does away with that and thinking about, how diverse our students are and how we can form assessments that truly will, get at what they're learning depending on who they are and are equitable, right? That don't privilege some students over others. And so, we all think, and the reason we're all part of this group and we agreed to do this, serve on this task group and why we're presenting to you today is that we don't think this is not just a more just way of assessing students, but we also think it's a better way to assess students, that you actually achieve the learning objectives of your course better if you take this approach to assessment. So you'll be hearing some examples as we go throughout today about, what this will look like in practice. And we understand that, for many of you, this is something that is completely new. And the idea of implementing this form of assessment in your courses might seem a little bit ambitious and beyond your reach. But what we'll try to do throughout is kind of talk about how you can kind of gradually work your way into this type of assessment. You could do some baby steps, or you could kind of go all out if you already have some comfort level. So next slide.
Okay, that's a perfect segue into a little discussion about the difference between equality and equity. And we felt it was important to recognize the difference between these two concepts. Now, many of you are probably familiar with this picture. It's been making the rounds quite a bit the last few years, but we wanted to share this because it really is a good illustration of the difference. So the left-hand side of the screen represents equality, and equality dictates that everyone receives the same treatment from the beginning. And this is problematic because, this fails to recognize that people are different and everyone has different needs. So in this example, we can see a tall person, a medium height person, and a short person all trying to enjoy a baseball game. The tall person really doesn't need any assistance seeing, whereas the medium height person needs a box to stand on to see, and that allows that person to be successful. But then we still have a short person who can't see, even though they receive the same supports as everybody else. Equity, on the other hand, recognizes that all of these individuals are different and they have different characteristics and different needs, and then the resources are distributed according to those needs with the goal of an equal result. So the equalness and the sameness is kind of placed in a different location. So with equality, it's sort of front loaded where everyone is given the same thing and then we kind of hope for the best. But with equity, the goal is really that everyone has an ability to be successful and to have a result that is fair. So when we relate this concept to assessment, we have to consider whether the assessment really is fair and whether all of the students truly have the opportunity to accurately demonstrate what they have learned with the assessment that we are giving them.
Okay, so what are some of the factors that influence issues of equity in the classroom? You can see some of them listed here on the screen. Inclusive and equitable assessment acknowledges that students enter our classes with different levels of preparedness, ability, access to resources, and more. And this can be influenced by factors like race or ethnicity, culture, language proficiency, socio-economic status, and learning differences. And it's also important to note that these factors don't exist in isolation. There are complex intersections between these factors that can create further inequities. Traditional assessments often seek to numerically compare these students in diverse groups to more traditionally advantaged students, measuring all against the same metric. This act can often reify existing inequalities and even widen those gaps further. Inclusive and equitable assessment seeks to acknowledge and accommodate these differences by questioning the assessment mechanisms themselves to consider the ways that they might serve to either exploit or rectify those differences. This often means examining existing assessment mechanisms and shifting the focus from product to process in order to better understand individual student gains and create opportunities for student agency. Ideally, this means implementing grading strategies that are accurate, bias resistant, motivational, and focused on learning outcome related achievement, not behavior or advantage. So we're going to be talking a little bit more specifically about some of these strategies next.
All right, so what are some characteristics of equitable assessment? I have several of them listed here, and I'm going to kind of go through an explanation of each one just to give a little bit more detail and background. So equitable assessment in general really involves taking a step back and looking at the learning objectives and using that as the focus. And the overall goal is to provide opportunities for all students to be able to demonstrate learning. So it is important to remember that the goal of assessment is to determine what students have learned in order to adjust teaching practices. And unfortunately, traditional assessments don't always allow us to do that because our students are affected by the factors that are listed on the previous slide. And when I refer to traditional assessments, I'm talking about the kinds of assessments that we probably all grew up with and experienced, through high school and college, the 100-question, multiple choice, Scantron tests, as well as research papers and things that were traditionally used to assess learning. So I will also note too that the pandemic created a challenge too, because many of our students experienced challenges that they never experienced before. And that also created a situation where we really had to kind of step back and think about what the goals are of assessing our students. So going into some of the limitations of these assessments, as we've been researching this topic, we have learned that, these traditional assessments tend to favor affluent, white, high achieving students, and many of our students don't fit those demographics. And those assessments become even more problematic when they're presented online. So students no longer have the ability to ask questions for clarification if they don't understand something on the exam. And they're subjected to strict time limits and other settings that are intended to promote academic integrity. And high stakes assessments often do not create an accurate representation of learning. And it's even more problematic when additional barriers are put into place in an attempt to prevent cheating. So equitable assessment really embraces achievement and growth of the students, and it seeks to involve them in the assessment process, and it encourages them to recognize their own progress over time as it relates to the achievement of the learning goals. And it's also really important to note that it's helpful to avoid punitive elements that don't relate to the learning objectives. So as an example of this, I see a lot of discussion boards that grade for grammar and spelling when grammar and spelling are not included in the learning objectives. And this can be harmful to students who may be able to understand and apply the concepts perfectly well without any trouble, but who may struggle with spelling and writing conventions. And it's also really important to embrace diversity. And I made a note here of something I saw on the Jamboard, which was honoring everyone's humanity while they're with you. And that is super important. And whoever wrote that, I really love that note. I thought that was great. When an assessment is equitable, it really focuses on the student, and there is a recognition that they're a real person with different interests and skills and abilities. And we know that learning can be demonstrated in a variety of ways. As an alternative to traditional tests and papers, students could have the option to create a video or an infographic or a non-traditional project or writing assignment. And another tool that I saw a lot in the research was a student-curated portfolio. And there are a number of case studies available from the National Institute for Learning Outcomes and Assessment, or NIOLA. NIOLA is the acronym. And we're going to be sharing a link to a website that we've created that includes all of our resources, and NIOLA is one of them. But in many of those case studies, they do sort of go over the process of using student curated portfolios as a tool, because then the students really have to focus on the objectives, and they have to put together a portfolio of their work that really shows that they have achieved those learning objectives. So they really have to think about their own learning, and that's really great and helpful. And the last item that we have here is the goal to remove barriers. And everything we're talking about today really goes hand in hand with universal design for learning, because it seeks to remove any obstacles that may prevent fair assessment of student learning. And in a couple of minutes, we are going to be sharing some simple adjustments that can be made to remove barriers to success. But first, we're going to share some strategies that can be used to really overhaul the way work is assigned and graded. So I'm going to hand it over to Judy, who is going to discuss labor-based grading.
So labor-based grading is a form of authentic assessment that values the time students spend on their coursework. Students are given feedback on their work or their labor and have the opportunity to continue working to improve their output on their essays, assignments, projects, etc., until they achieve the grade they desire based on their grading contract. Knowing that they will not be given grades for each individual assignment, the students can be more creative and take more risks with their work. The feedback they receive from their instructor focuses on improving and encouraging their work instead of justifying a grade. The students can keep track of their time spent on revisions based on instructor feedback and improve their work through this iterative process. This allows all students the same potential to earn a high grade in a course, regardless of their writing ability prior to the start of a course. So there are different models of labor-based grading varying from instructor to instructor, but typically you start off with a grading contract that you create collaboratively, and all students, if they meet the parameters of the contract, could earn a B, or if they go above and beyond for an A, or they can stop when they've earned the grade that they wish. The extra work for an A might include citing additional sources or completing extra revisions. The contract shown here is somewhat skeletal. Contracts can encompass group projects, service learning, or other course work, other course-specific work, provided that the students have a clear understanding of the expectations. So the next strategy we have for you is ungrading.
So that's me. So ungrading is, again, it's a little bit less of a specific strategy than labor-based grading. It's actually more of a labor-based grading, as you see below, is actually incorporated within an ungrading approach. If you were at CIT 2 weeks ago, you heard we had a keynote from Jesse Stommel. Jesse is sort of the patron saint of ungrading. I don't know if you want to say that, but Jesse's the one that has really publicized it, made it something that's a little bit more well known throughout higher ed. And there's been a lot of research on it. A lot of people are sort of gaining some traction. And it emerges from this idea of critical pedagogy, where, like what we've been talking about, that, teaching and learning really should come from a place of, again, being equitable, inclusive, and all the things we've been talking about today. And Jesse takes it to that, talks about digital critical pedagogy and sort of extending these practices to an online environment. And really what ungrading is, first and foremost, is a critique of traditional grading practices, as I mentioned earlier. So traditional grading, as I said, ignores diversity. It fails to capture learning, that it's really just not an effective way to assess learning outcomes of students. And then last, it really does a lot to, at the very least, not motivate students. And at the worst, it actually causes, I think, harm to many students and pushes a lot of students away from education. I actually teach a course, and last semester I had 2 students write about, the damaging effects of what they like to call harsh grading, when instructors grade, and it really kind of demotivates and actually makes them not want to participate actively in their courses. So the way ungrading works generally is that feedback is from assessment. It separates feedback from assessment. So any feedback you get, and a lot of you may have heard the terms formative and summative assessment, where formative assessment is the kind of feedback that you give students about learning activities, and you use it to improve their performance as opposed to judge or evaluate their performance. And again, what ungrading does is just completely separates the feedback process from an actual assessment where you're giving them a grade or you're giving them an evaluation. And it does that not just by saying, well, we're going to do some summative and some formative, and the formative might lead to summative, but what it does is it tries to get rid of numerical grades completely. And there are various approaches to grading. So for example, that do this. So for example, I use specifications grading in my class. In my classes, and in that type of grading, you don't give any letter grades to students until the end of the semester. So similar to contract-based grading, labor-based grading, specifications grading gives students, they complete assignments and they either get credit or they don't. And if they don't get credit, they usually have opportunities to redo the work. And so you just try to not have grades at all. And now that's not completely unrealistic, because many of us, if not all of us, have to give a letter grade at the end of the semester unless you're teaching a pass-fail class. So, typically there is a moment where you have to give a letter grade or a number grade or something like that. But the ungrading approach is to sort of just get rid of that to the extent that you can. And then the final grades are usually determined in an ungrading approach by student reflections or collaborative discussions between the instructor and the student. So it's a dialogue kind of a process, and self-assessment is really important. So students really have to learn that skill of trying to figure out, are they learning what they're supposed to be learning in the course? Are they learning what they said they were going to learn throughout the semester? And so it really, self-assessment is important. Collaboration between instructors and students is important, and that dialogue that should culminate at the end with a recognition of what has been learned throughout the semester. It becomes the basis for a numerical grade or a letter grade that you have to give at the end of the semester. So there are about 7 different types of ungrading approaches there. I'm not going to go into detail in all of them. You can look them up if you're looking for details about how to implement them. But grade-free zones is essentially just that you're going to do certain things during the semester and there'll just be no grading. All right. And you're just going to be able to practice and have that freedom to not worry about being formally evaluated. Minimal grading, similar. We've already talked about labor-based grading, which is similar to contract grading. But a lot of these methods utilize portfolios of student work. And really, again, it gives students the opportunity to show what they're authentically learning in the class, and sort of, as opposed to sort of traditional kind of memorization based rote learning kind of assessments. Peer assessment is also a big part of it. So a lot of it is individual, student to student, but clearly you can have a community of students kind of collectively helping to influence. If you attended the session I did on rethinking the syllabus yesterday, I talked about courses in which students kind of co-create the course throughout the semester together. And so that is certainly in the ungrading approach. And then student-made rubrics is another good way to kind of do this, where you can have students determine what the rubric for an assignment should be collectively and come up with what counts as a completed project or an incomplete project. So that's the overall gist of it. And again, I'll just say this, it is definitely something that you can implement in a wide variety of ways. There's no one way to do ungrading, and it's something that you can start with baby steps or something you could do completely your whole course. All right, next slide.
Chris, before we go on to the next one, Diane had asked in the chat how you determine the letter grade at the end for your specifications grading. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So what I do is it really depends on the number of assignments that they complete. So, an A grade, they just do everything. B grade, there's usually some, they can miss things. And then a C grade, it's usually less. So it's pretty simple. They get a certain number of tokens throughout the semester, so they can use to redo assignments or to count as sort of low stakes assignments. And so, even if they do miss something and they really want that A grade, they can use those tokens, and they only get a certain amount. And in some cases they can earn more. And then at the end, I just kind of add it all up. And I have to say, I'll never go back to grading assignments on the regular, during the semester. I don't think I'd be teaching right now, frankly, if I had to do that, because I teach as extra service on top of what I do at CPD. It takes a little effort though. And I think one thing I didn't mention with ungrading and all these approaches is you really have to spend some time talking to your students about why you do what you do and kind of walking them through it, because it's not a normal practice that they're used to. And so it does require for some students a little bit of handholding and a little bit of just, extra explanation for them, especially around the mid-semester point, because, that's always a challenge for me. Is like, we have to do midterm grades at Brockport. And I'm like, I have to really guess at what their midterm grade is, because really it's the end of the semester that I can count everything up and let them know, what their grade is.
Thanks, Chris.
Sure.
Maybe we can go back when we come to the next Jamboard. Maureen had asked about skills-based classes, so maybe that's a topic that we can bring up again when we get to the Jamboard. So I'll be sharing some adjustments that you all might want to consider in terms of removing barriers. And before we talk about those specifics of what those adjustments can be, it's important to reflect on our own experiences as students. And so, Megan, I have transitions in here. If you want to go ahead there, thank you. So if we think back to how we were assessed as students, that's really critical, because oftentimes, even if we're trained teachers and we have a lot of theoretical knowledge about pedagogy, oftentimes we can tend to do with our students as has been done to us. And so if we think about how we had been assessed as students, and then we reflect on what we are currently doing, if there's a lot of alignment between those two things, chances are we're not really thinking outside of the box. So that's one thing that can help begin this process. The second thing is to think about if we, in our own experiences, have experienced diversity in assessment or barriers to assessment. If we ourselves have never experienced a barrier to an assessment, then we aren't recognizing the challenges that some of our students are facing. Also, if we haven't had a lot of diversity in the ways we've been assessed, if it's been multiple choice tests, essays, very traditional types of assessment, then again, we haven't had that experience as well. So that's another important thing to reflect on. And thirdly, thinking about why we are assessing the way we are. Are we doing it just because that's what we know? Are we doing it because we have talked to our students and asked them about their experiences and how they can best show what they know? Have we done the research? Have we talked to colleagues? So it's important to really ask ourselves why we're doing what we're doing. And this can go for a situation where we might be maybe teaching a course that someone else has created, or if we're creating a course from scratch, especially if we have, say, for example, I am in the modern languages department. And so in our department, some language textbooks and curriculums come with designed assessments already embedded in the curriculum. And so are we choosing something just because it's available, or are we thinking outside of the box and choosing something that might be more equitable and inclusive for our students? Next, what is it that we're assessing? And Megan did talk a little bit about this in our in her slide, but when we look at how we're grading our students and what we're choosing to deduct points from or count points for, is it in line with not only our course objectives and our course content, but what our students are going to be doing with that information later in their lives? So for example, I work with pre-service teachers who are studying to be teachers of English to speakers of other languages. And in my context, it's incredibly important that my students are writing with the correct conventions of written English, because they're going to be English teachers. If they're sloppy about that in even a discussion forum, then that is concerning to me when I think about them being teachers. However, there might be situations within my own course where I don't grade for spelling and grammar. For example, I have them do a journal entry that's just between the two of us, where I just want their thoughts and their ideas and their information. And that's a case where I wouldn't assess for spelling and grammar. And then also, the really important thing is to ask our students, to sit down with our students, to ask our students, what has assessment been like for you? Have there been any barriers? Are there any ways that you wish you could show what you know that you've never been asked to do so? So having those, I think especially one-on-one conversations with our students, or asking those open-ended questions and allowing them to share that information with us, perhaps even in an anonymous way, can really help bring some awareness to their perspectives and their experiences in ways that are different from our own. So when we then move into what those adjustments can be, we have to look at a couple of things. So why are we doing what we're doing? Where are we doing these things, and for whom? And one important thing to consider when we look at especially online assessments is looking at time limits. Is it really necessary to have a time limit on a given assessment? Why are we doing that? In which cases are we doing that? For whom are we doing that? So that is a consideration that we might want to remove. Another one is forced completion. So is it really imperative that we have the students start and then finish? Or in some cases, might we consider that they can stop and then restart? And so again, all of these adjustments might not be things that you do for everything, but there might be different situations where these might be more applicable. Spelling and conventions of written English, we already addressed that and talked about that, but that's one thing for consideration. Next, when we look at multiple choice or selected response questions, why are we forming our questions in those ways? Have we done the research on best practices and how to actually write those questions? Have we removed the options of all of the above or none of the above, which can be just feel tricky for students and cause some anxiety? So if you do use selected response and multiple choice questions, I encourage you to dig in a little bit more deeply and look at some of the research on how to best word those types of questions and what options are more appropriate to leave out. Next, looking at initial responses. And so, for example, with a test, say, for example, on a learning management system such as Blackboard, and we have it set so that the students, once they go on, they can't go back. Well, is that really necessary? Can we have them go back and revisit their initial responses? Might their ideas change, or might something come to them later on as they move through the questions? So that's another thing to consider. And lastly, just one more here, looking at having a bank of questions and using that conditional release of different question forms. So depending upon the student's experience and how they move through what they've already done, we might be able to set it up that way as well. So next, the one other thing I did want to add too is not only in looking at our own experiences as students, but looking at our teachers, looking at our professors, our instructors that we have had. If our instructors were not of a different race, culture, language background, class, ability, orientation than we are, then we perhaps aren't looking through this lens of what might be challenging for our students. So I'll pass it on to Chris. Or no. Yes, Chris, go ahead.
So Megan, you're gonna do the tour, or? Yeah, great. So as part of our work for this Fact 2 subcommittee, or actually the entire committee on assessment of student learning, we've put together a website to basically collect research, best practices, and examples throughout SUNY about innovative assessments. And I think a lot of the credit here goes to Chilton Reynolds from Oneonta and Nicole Simon from Nassau, who did a lot of the work putting this together. You may have received one of the first step we did. Well, obviously we put all of the work that the research that we did on the various subcommittees, which you actually see there. So we were obviously on the social justice committee. There's one on real world assessment, multiple pathways, and learning recognition. So those are the other 3 subcommittees. And we put together a survey, or actually Chilton, I think, and Nicole did, that we sent out over the last few months to Fact 2 reps, to campuses directly. I mean, I know I sent it to a lot of people who I know who work in teaching and learning centers, and asked them to send it to instructors who are doing innovative assessments. And then we've tagged those examples. So let me just, Megan, if you could just dig into our section, we could show what that looks like. So all the sections are kind of go first. You'll see this is basically our report that we sent in about what social justice assessment is. A lot of it is what we're talking to you about today. And it kind of just breaks it all down. You don't have to go, we're already doing that for you. So, and then the other thing too, if you go to the menu again for social justice, there are resources. So there's the overview. And then the second part for each section are resources. So this is actually, I think, a really great part for you to go to read more about everything related to social justice assessment. I know a lot of this is in our presentation as well, but you could dig even deeper here, and we'll be adding to this too as we continue to do our work. And then the last piece is our examples, and this is the part that I'm the most excited about. This is the part where we do need to do more work to, I saw Maureen, I think it was Maureen, or maybe it was Adele, mentioned in the chat, like, I'm already doing this type of assessment, labor-based grading. I just didn't know to call it that. And then we suspect there are a lot more people doing innovative assessment work and social justice assessment approaches. And so we're looking for more examples of that. So we have some in there already. And, the idea is to give people an idea of who's doing this work in SUNY. And so if you are, we would love for you to fill it out. If you go to the website, and I don't know if you put the link in the chat yet to the website, but there is the link. If you go to the homepage, right, I think, Megan, it gives you the link to the Google survey where you can submit your assessment strategy. And what we're really looking for is just a snippet of your syllabus, and then just what the group that, or where it would fit under these categories, and you can select multiple ones. And then if you keep going down, Megan, name who you are, you consent to share this publicly, and then if you could keep scrolling down, subject, the course, how you use it, and then additional attachments. And so how you use it could really just be, a snippet from your syllabus, or you could add your syllabus there, and recommend number of students. So and whether or not it's something that's in one class period or the entire course. Now, a lot of things we've been talking about today are kind of an entire course approach. And then if you have any links or resources that you want to put in there. So we're pretty flexible about how you get it in there, but really, so if you get this form and you're like, oh, I don't know exactly how to answer that, that's fine. Just do what you can, and then we'll format it so that it kind of fits with the website. But so I think that's it we want to say about this now. So I guess we go to the next slide, Megan.
Okay, and Chris just covered this. So again, if you realize now that you are using some of these strategies, but maybe didn't have the language previously, we would love it if you would be able to share those examples so we can share them to the wider community.
So as a sort of a ticket out the door here, we would love for you to share an example that you're already doing. And as Chris had mentioned, we have some folks in the chat have said, oh, I'm already doing that. I just wasn't calling it that. So anything that you heard today that you realize that you're already doing that, please go ahead back to that Jamboard, and Judy just put the link in the chat again for us, and share anything that you are currently doing. There is another section that asks for you to share any strategies or adjustments you would like to try or attempt with your students. So that's another one that you can add to. We do have just one example on each slide already so that you can see that, but you can toggle between the different pages and go back and forth and add your own input there. And maybe while folks are contributing to this, if anyone wants to add to the conversation about challenges for skills-based classes and looking at more of these flexible assessment methods and approaches. Anyone who's on the call who wants to unmute yourselves and share, or anyone who wants to share in the chat.
Oh, hello, everyone. Thank you for a great talk. I think I wrote in the chat, one thing I'm doing these days, because my dissertation is also on giving feedback and also formative assessment. So one thing I'm doing these days, I'm recording the students' engagement with the curriculum during the course that they're taking with me. And basically, I've noticed there are some students, sometimes they start their, I can say, presenting their engagements after several sessions. Sometimes they're absent for 2 or 3 sessions, and suddenly they show up. So especially during the online classes, this really has become common among most of the students who are really struggling with the condition and any context they're coming from. So I even value when the students are reaching out to me, asking if their emails are considered, are graded as a part of labor grading, as Chris was mentioning, and all of you were mentioning. So I try to value that, the result that I've received so far is very, very good. And many students appreciate that I'm trying to be that much flexible. Some of them have no choice, asking for incomplete grade because they need more time to submit their assignments. And just wanted to add that for skill-based classes, if we also focus or value students' engagement with the curriculum, with their, communication with us, that way we can motivate the students and also help them learn something and also get a grade that can be accepted. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ali. The one thing that I wanted to share too was going back to what Chris was saying about the difference between formative and summative assessments. And in some of those more skills-based classes, one way to do kind of a hybrid model of this is to use the formative assessments as an opportunity to have students practice. And as Ali was mentioning there, sometimes students will not demonstrate understanding initially, but then after a few weeks or a few passes at something, then it might click and they might get it. And so those formative assessments could be just scored perhaps for completion or not. Did they do it or did they not? And then later, there could be more of a summative assessment on that information that is higher stakes, that is counted, that does have a grade or a number associated with it. And the benefit of that for, I think, both the student and the instructor is that the students have had opportunities to get it wrong and then be motivated to get it right without that pressure of a grade. And then by the time they get to that summative, more higher stakes assessment, they hopefully are going to perform better on it because they've had those passes at practice in a lower stakes type of situation.
Yeah, just reading some of the comments and hearing some of you talk. I mean, I guess one thing we didn't mention here, but I think is really crucial to this approach is the idea of metacognition and how important that is in learning in general, and just like students being able to think about their thinking and learning and being able to reflect on that. And really, this approach doesn't work unless you kind of engage students in those sort of discussions about, thinking about their learning and recognizing where their strengths lie and how they can leverage those strengths and where they need to, make improvements. And it's really just this ongoing dialogue between you and your student and students. And I know that in a larger class, it's a little trickier. Jessica was talking about in the last semester doing some really innovative things, though classes with 90, so you might need to leverage technology a little bit more if you're going to do these approaches in a larger class so that you could scale them. But I have regular email interactions with my students, and sometimes when they have to redo something, initially I'll have them redo it and submit it in the LMS. But then, if they have to redo, it's like, just email me back. Like here's a question I have for you. Just, write back to me like what you think about what I've said here. So it's not so it's just more of like a dialogue between the two of us. And I should mention that my class is totally online. So, that does present, challenges as well, because you can't have that real-time communication. Although sometimes I just have to get on the phone with them and we have to talk it through, or in Zoom or something like that.
And that's a great point, Chris, looking at the opportunities for an oral assessment, even if it's informal. And as you said, with larger classes, that can be much more of a challenge, but even taking 2 to 3 minutes to have a student talk through and explain what they understand about something is another form that we can offer for students. And it's something that's done very frequently in language courses, oral assessments, but thinking about how we can have students do that in other disciplines as well can be another avenue.
So as we have the Jamboards open, and it'll stay open even after this session. So you're welcome to contribute to it later on or look back and refer to it later. But we wanted to know if you had any other questions, if anything else you'd like to ask us while we're here. And additionally, we've got our contact information on the next slide. So if you'd like to email any of us down the road, we're all here. And I see a question already. Are there any tips for building in a more collaborative assessment approach when the nature of the discipline is more rigid, say in the health sciences, where there are legally mandated and obviously necessary practice behaviors that are much less negotiable? That's a great, more collaborative assessment where things are legally mandated. Ali is suggesting that project-based assessments might help. And I teach history, so I don't have any of these like mandated things that I'm trying to fit in. I wonder if anybody else has something to suggest. Paula said, how do you write your syllabus to show that this is your approach? I think that's a separate question. Diane's suggesting that for Andrew's question, this probably requires a mix of competency-based with authentic assessment. That makes a lot of sense to me, like work in these practices where you can, and have your more structured formal assessment for your accreditors where you have to. I don't know, Chris, I see you nodding. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would just say, Judy. I mean, I think that, in the presentation I did a few days ago, when you're thinking about your designing your course, there are certain sort of factors that you just have to take into consideration. And so, for those who are in, accredited disciplines like nursing and others, where, there are exams that students are preparing for. I mean, I think you just have to start with that as a given and then design around that. And so, and take a critical eye towards everything you do to get to that point. So, you have to get students to a certain point, you have to prepare them to maybe take an exam. But then, what are the things that you can change? What are the things that the ways in which you can, again, provide that flexibility that, account for who they are and what their skills are, and really give them that support that they need to be successful based on where they're at. And so, they really, and it changes semester to semester. It's the challenge with this approach is that, you have a different set of students every semester. And so you're constantly having to improvise. And so, so unfortunately there isn't sort of like okay, here's how you do it in every situation kind of approach. It is that sort of mindset that you have to change first. And then, and so it is hard to give advice about outside of our disciplines, and that, so that's why we're hoping to get a lot more examples on the website so that you could see, oh, there's somebody teaching nursing and using this approach, and let me connect with them and see what they're doing, and maybe I could adopt some of those approaches.
Yeah, and Athena suggested getting buy-in and then, to those structured assessments and then moving toward a portfolio. And that's an interesting way to mix it up too.
And the thing that I think about in terms of my students, again, who are preparing to be teachers, they do have certification exams that they have to take and pass. And what I tell them is when you're standing up in front of your students, you have to have that information internalized, right? It's not just this memorization that you're going to save for the exam, for the certification exam, and then it's going to go out of your memory. So thinking in fields such as nursing as well, it's that way as well, that they aren't just memorizing something for an exam. They have to practically be able to know those things and employ that information in the moment, oftentimes in a very stressful, perhaps even life or death type of situation. So yeah, looking at scenario-based assessments, and again, making that transition from the formative to the summative, and reminding students that yes, you need to take this exam, yes, you need to know these details, but you also need to be able to practice it in the moment and recall it in those moments as well.
Paul was asking how you write up this in your syllabus, and so I would suggest, and this kind of builds off what I was talking about yesterday, and thinking about your syllabus, that your syllabi, that really trying to have a whole separate section. So if you and I'll grab the link after before we leave, and I'll put it in the chat for those who weren't attended yesterday. But there was a person who was doing, she called it Liquid Syllabus, and it was she basically used Google Sites to create her syllabus, and she had a whole page about grading and assessment and this sort of thing. And I said earlier in the chat that I think it's really important to clearly explain that, almost separate from, I mean, you obviously have to have it in your syllabus, but it's something that requires almost a separate conversation with your students. So in my online course, I have like my welcome video, and then I have my video where I kind of talk about the syllabus, and I bring them through the course shell and talk about all that stuff. And then I have a third video that just talks about my approach to grading. And I try to, and then if students have questions, I refer them back to that, and I answer their in my answer to their questions. So it really requires its own separate conversation, and it just needs to be reinforced throughout for every assignment. Just exactly what you're doing and how you're doing it, and what they should do with the feedback they get from you.
Another thing that I had brought up in I think it was the fireside chat with Jesse Stommel at the CIT, was the fact that, and some folks had mentioned this in the chat, that our students are so used to this, that they have come through a K-12 system where grades have been made to be very important to them, and they can't just immediately shake that once they get into college. So again, as one who works with pre-service teachers, I think about the impact that using some of these different approaches, if I do it with my students, then hopefully they're going to do it with their students in the K-12 system, and talk with their colleagues about it, and talk with their administrators about it. And hopefully it will influence some change at that level, so that it's not such a drastic change when students get to the college level as well.
Yeah, like Mark's comment in the chat about teaching math, and really sort of saying, if you do the homework, there's enough points to pass the course just by homework alone, where you're not in a stressful exam taking environment. And so he was asking if others do that in math. And so that's, again, hopefully that's the dialogue we'd like to encourage more of. So others are doing that, let Mark know. But I think it's good. There's another one there. Let's see, there's another one under there. Let's see here. Regarding the syllabus, for example, if a student submits all assignments, do you write it so, or do you add a rubric? So in my particular case with specifications grading, it's not a, and that's actually the other thing about this type of grading. It's easier. So like when you do the traditional A, B, C, D, E rubric or F rubric, you have to come up with criteria for each of those areas. But when you go to ungrading, there's just, and you follow like a mastery approach or a specifications approach, is just, this is what you got to do to get credit or not, right? So it simplifies the process of assessing student work. And I always say the reason I do this is because I got so sick of trying to figure out what's the difference between a C+ and a B-. I mean, to me, it's like, one day it's a B-, the other day it's a C+. And even if I have it in the rubric, it's still, I think it is so much subjectivity there. But it matters a lot to a student, right? Whether or not they get a B+ or a C-, a B- or a C+. So, the rubrics that you have for these approaches typically are just one, category of this is what you need to do. But they're written in such a way that you might allow for multiple paths to achieve those specifications, in my case, at least.
Well, thank you all for joining us today and asking these questions. And we plan to continue this conversation in the next academic year and watch for information on a symposium that we hope to be putting forward. So please, again, let us know, follow up with email if you have any questions, or continue on with the Jamboard and use the website and send us your examples.
Thanks so
And-
much for presenting, everyone. I think that based on the conversation alone, it was a really inspiring and kind of conversation starter. I think it's important for all of us to take a peek at that. So thank you all for doing that. We're going to break for lunch now, and I'm going to stop recording. We're going to break for lunch.